Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first masterclass from Nordic Schools. And today we have invited Dr. Jim Rogers, who will in a minute present himself. But what we're going to talk about is that Jim is, as some of you might know, from England, and would like to talk about the differences and the similarities between the Danish and the British or English school system. So that's basically what you're going to hear about today. We would like to do it from the perspective of the school leader and from the perspective of the teacher. And of course, never forget from the students or the pupils, because they're actually the most important things going on in the schools, which we sometimes forget. Anyway, welcome, Jim Rogers. Please, could you make an introduction?
Hello. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Casper. Yeah, my name's Jim Rogers. I work here in England. I live in the southwest of England. I've been involved in education as a career for over 25 years now. And I've had I guess, quite an unusual career because part of it has been in schools. So I started as a teacher. In fact, I started working with special needs kids in London with the little tackers, we call them, the youngest children around sort of 4 to 7 years old. Became a secondary school teacher for 12 years and school leader. And then took a very brave step into the world of academia. It's brave because I don't see myself as particularly academic. So it was a really good challenge for me. And I worked in academia for 8 years at Exeter University. And during that time, also worked with lots of trainee teachers and trained secondary school teachers. For the last 5 years, I've brought all of those experiences together to work in school improvement, working regionally, supporting schools, particularly supporting schools that have been in some trouble and helping support them and help them move forward, and continue to train staff and train school leaders. And a year ago, took another brave step into the world of working independently. So I now work for myself, but I continue to work regionally across the southwest. And a couple of things that really make me tick, Casper, is learning from outside of education and also outside of our country. So learning what other countries are doing, how their education systems work, and how we can access research and evidence to inform our thinking. So that's me.
Hello, Jim, and thank you very much for that warm welcome. I was just wondering, when you say Southwest, to people outside of England, where is that specifically?
So I live in a county called Cornwall, which is the most southwestern tip of England, mainland British Isles. And my area, I guess, I particularly work regionally with the Teaching School Council, which we'll talk about later. So I would cover an area from Bristol across to Swindon, down to Poole and Bournemouth, and then all the way across to Land's End in Cornwall. But I'm based in Cornwall, which is a beautiful place to be in lockdown.
Yes, of course. Yeah, and even if it's not locked down, because I've been there before Corona, and it's such a couple of times actually, and it's such a beautiful place you have there. We don't have any places like that in this country, but we have other things. So let's get to school business. And actually, I thought, I go to, as you know, I'm a consultant too, of course, and the viewer might know too. And we go to conferences and we meet teachers and we go to schools and we very often see things from the from the adult perspective. And now I want to see it from the children's perspective. So from the primary school student or the pupil and the secondary school pupil. So you've been to Denmark a lot of times. What would you say are the similarities that are really, the strong similarities, or how you would put it, between England and the British school system and the Danish school system?
From a pupil perspective, from a child's perspective,
Yeah.
well, of course, I'm not a child anymore, Casper, although some people think I am. But I think I'm a parent, and I've all of my research actually has involved a pupil perspective, because I think, like you, that the pupils are the children are the most important things. So what I've seen as the similarities in both England and Denmark, and the first one will sound really obvious, but kids enjoy school. So even if they tell you they don't enjoy school, they enjoy school. They enjoy school because it's social, because it's structured, it's got routines, And maybe for them at the bottom of the list is that's where learning takes place as well. But I think one of the things that we've seen, particularly at the minute during school closures, is how much children are missing each other, and also how much they're missing being in school and that connectivity they have with teachers. It's that it's the relationship element. So I think a big similarity for both is children are children, and you know, we're in a strange situation at the minute, but isolation doesn't do them any good. And the opportunity to be together and to socialize and learn together is really, really important. So for me, they're similarities. I think there's an interesting cultural similarity between Denmark and England in the sense that I think we have a similar sense of humor. And that I can see that in the children as well. You know, similar things make the kids smile and laugh. And I think there's culturally is a real similarity. And I'll just pick up, we may talk about some of the differences in a minute, but we're getting a lot of media attention around the education system in Denmark because you've opened earlier than us and you closed earlier than us as well. And there's a fantastic film on our BBC website, national BBC website, 3-minute film about Denmark, talking to primary school children, the youngest children, and their quality of English is just fantastic, you know, and of the teachers. And it makes me feel very humble and a little bit embarrassed that we still retain this kind of English centric perspective on kind of education and so on. But there's a subtle difference there that I think we could learn from you guys.
So thanks for talking about the similarities a lot, because sometimes I think the humor perspective and the whole value perspective is absolutely true. And we've been so lucky, the guys from the Nordic Schools, to visit England. We've felt the same, you know, immediately a connection, a rapport where of course, because we all like working with children, like being teachers or school leaders, but also because there is a sense of humor and sometimes a distance and things that are alike. And then most of us grew up on BBC and other and Channel 4, and you know we've seen and heard English music, seen English films, so a lot of similarities culturally there too. So let's talk about the differences, and let's keep the student or pupil perspective. What would you say are the differences?
This is a real tricky one, because I think that when you conduct a school visit, whether it's within your own country or another country, it's very easy to, we have a saying, the grass is greener on the other side. So it's easy to assume that the other place is better, or you pick out differences without seeing the similarities first. So I think the order of your questions is right. You know, the similarities are really strong. The difference is, I like to think, I like to try and look at things in the big picture, and it's a tricky one, this, because I think that the English education system over the last few years has become more driven about performance and measured in a performance metric. So how much are the kids learning? What are their grades? What is their progress? How well do they do it in exams? And I think that impacts children's behavior. So we know, you and I know, Casper, that if you come from a perspective that relationships are the most important thing, and you get that foundation right, then learning takes place. If you go at it from just a performance perspective, the one thing that you're missing is that dynamic of the relationship between the teacher and the pupil. And I think we miss that sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes in schools in England. And that can play out in children's behavior. So behavior can sometimes be challenging in English schools. I'm sure it can be in Danish schools as well. We see, I think in primary schools, I've spoken to primary teachers where they've been concerned about the extremes of behavior. You know, they're compliant in the lesson, which is not necessarily engaged in learning. And then they go crazy at break time, at playtime, because they have all this energy that they need to get rid of. And then they're compliant again in class. Now, I don't know enough about the Danish schools to know if that's systematic and endemic in schools as well. But one of the things that struck me in Danish schools is the calmness of the environment in the schools, the trust that's placed on the children in their learning, the transition between lessons and from lessons to playtime seems a lot calmer, a lot more even. There's less kind of spikes or extremes. And I can't quite put my finger on why, but I suspect it's because you come at education from a slightly different perspective around those relationships, around that kind of rapport with young people, and an element of trust. So for me, they're subtle differences. There's a big focus on behaviour in this country at the minute, and for some of the secondary schools, we have a behaviour czar working for the government. We have behavioural specialists working regionally. And for me, it's like it just comes down to some real basic principles of respect and support, and having the right people in place to support the most kind of vulnerable and needy children. And I suspect you have that in the Danish system, and we struggle with that a little bit in the English system.
Yeah. Another thing, there are two things that I always love to show to English visitors, and you've seen them both. One is, of course, there are no school uniforms. I think there's one or two schools here you can find where they have school uniforms, but normally children have them. And you can say pros and cons about that, but it's just a difference. Another thing is that rarely, a school is very rarely fenced. So when we've been to England, and I've been a lot of places in England, normally there will be a fence around the school for many reasons, I know, but still there will be. And whereas in Denmark, I love to take like the group we had last autumn, where we just walked into the school and said, where are the fences? And what about the visitors tax and all that? And we say, well, there aren't any. So just to give people an idea of trust, and you'll find that in all of the Nordic schools and in many other countries too, but it's just a very specific thing to mention. And I think that's deeply rooted, the trust in that. Well, what about the children? Don't they run into the street and get killed? Or don't they get kidnapped by pedophiles? Well, that rarely happens, luckily. Although we have kidnapping and we have pedophiles, but it just rarely happens. So it's just important just to give the viewer and I a specific idea about this.
I think I'd like to come in there quickly, Casper, because I was going to mention this later from a visitor's perspective. That is one of the most powerful, subtle messages that you can provide to a visitor going into your schools in Denmark. The fact that you can approach the school from any direction, walk into the area of the school without confrontation. You don't have a sign-in desk. We don't provide ID. I remember I came across last summer, Casper, and we just walked into the principal's office and left our bags, and he wasn't even there. And I was saying to you, can we actually do this? Are we allowed to? And it really does present a very kind of almost kind of an invisible message. You know, it's normal for you, and it's so starkly different for us. And I think it comes back to the academization of teaching and school system, and the accountability that we have as school leaders in our country, and responsibility. So if something happened on a school grounds here and it was an academy, the CEO of that academy is responsible by law and could be put in jail. So there's a real kind of there's a real reason for it. It's not just because of fear, but I think that has something to do with it as well. So, you know, of all the things, that to me is probably the starkest difference as a visitor to schools in England or Denmark.
So let's leave that perspective. Thank you very much. And let's go, because I was thinking when you started talking, one of the things that I find, so let me just use the word weird about the English school system, is the whole idea of accountability, and especially something called Ofsted inspectors. So and I've met some very nice people who were Ofsted inspectors, quite strict people, but very, very skilled. So I'm not saying it's only a bad thing. This is something we do not have in the Nordic countries. Maybe we should have sometimes, but we don't have. And I don't think we should actually. So tell me a bit about the differences there. How do you experience that from an English point of view? And I'm talking about, you know, the teachers and the school management not having the same kind of accountability, because you've met quite a few school leaders in this country, in Denmark.
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. And I think that there's two parts to this. I think I need to make a case for Ofsted. So, and then discuss what the impact of having that system is on schools and school leaders. So we have an independent body that inspects the quality of teaching and education in our schools called Ofsted. It's the Office for Standards in Teaching and Education, I think it's called. And it's because we use public money to spend on schools and teacher salaries and school buildings and on materials and education. So it is felt by the government that we need to have an independent body quality assuring education in England against the government's measures for performance. But to be fair, Ofsted also responsible for their own inspection framework. So they develop and revise their own framework for inspections. So we have it because we feel as a country that we need to hold teachers and leaders to account for the quality of education. And recently, since 2018, there's been a research lead. That guy is called Professor Muirs. He's going to be in one of my podcasts coming up soon. He's the Deputy Director for Ofsted. And they've taken a very different approach to the new framework for Ofsted, which is research informed. It even has an area around workload for teachers and mental health and well-being. So they want to be seen as a force for good in school practice. Okay, so they're trying to do what they can to ensure that their framework is a driver for good in schools. The flip side is the one you're referring to, I think, is that the level of pressure and responsibility on schools is enormous. One element of this is very simple. If you are an outstanding school, then you'll attract more children. If you attract more children, you get more money. With more money, you can do more things. So there's a real incentive for schools to be outstanding. If you're outstanding, you don't get inspected so often, so you get a bit more breathing space. And it even has an impact on house prices in a local community because people want to go to an outstanding school. But the pressure is enormous. It can lead to, in my experience, a tokenistic response to the Ofsted framework. So if Ofsted say that they are going to look at, so one of the things at the minute is around the curriculum offer, then the school's response is, well, we need to define curriculum. What does curriculum mean? And why are you teaching maths? And why are you teaching the way the way you're teaching it? And it, to me, it misses the important elements of education, which is much, much deeper than that. So it's a strange one. I think that those school leaders that are brave enough to do their own thing and still meet Ofsted requirements are the ones that are particularly effective. But some poor practice I see is where schools are only worried about Ofsted and are restricting other areas of activity in response to that. It can be quite stifling. And it's there for all schools, whether you're a maintained school, so supported by the local authority, a bit like your system, or an academy school, which is where a school is responsible for their own education standards. It becomes a business. You're still accountable to Ofsted. And Ofsted inspect colleges and nurseries and other areas of education as well.
So, I mean, it puts a lot of pressure on the school, on the teachers and so forth. And I think you're actually very good at saying the good sides and the bad sides. Now, since we don't have this system in the Nordic countries, what do you think about the school management you've seen? I mean, I know it's a weird question because you've met so many leaders, but what do you think of the level of management quality, and how do you think the management works when they do not have Ofsted inspectors in the Nordic countries?
Well, that's a really good question, Casper. Clearly, it works. It works in the Nordic countries. Your approach works because your education systems are effective and you score well in international measures, and people look to you for expertise. In my experience of meeting school leaders, particularly in Copenhagen, I've been struck by a couple of things. One is professional pride. There's a real sense of pride, and that includes pride in leadership. But the leadership is, for me anyway, about investing in staff around them. So I've been particularly impressed with how your school leaders are very in tune with staff development needs and also their personal and emotional sort of well-being. It's not explicit, it's an implicit part of your culture, which I think is really, really impressive. I think there is clearly a sense of responsibility for children and parents and communities in terms of quality of education, which is one of the big drivers. And it is the same here, but obviously we have the extra layer of Ofsted as well. And I think what's interesting and what I'd like to find out more about is to what level you collaborate. So one of the big things here is that an alternative way of improving schools is through collaboration. So through a peer review model where you can review each other or collaborate around specific kind of themes and needs. And that's been something that's developed over the last few years through the teaching school model, which I think is something that other nations could learn from. I think it's a really, really powerful model. So, I think the big thing for me is that implicit awareness of staff needs that school leaders are particularly tuned into in what I've seen in the Danish schools and Sweden as well when I've been there. It's really impressive.
So I think you're touching something now, because I think it's important also to flip the coin and see it from another perspective, because otherwise this is a beautiful and very long praise of the Nordic schools. And please don't stop. But just for now, I think actually when you're talking about the teaching schools, this is something I thought, how do they have the time in the British school system? I'm so impressed. I mean, the whole framework, the whole idea is so brilliant, and it seems to be working. When it works, it's such a good idea. So I would love something like that. It happens here, but very rarely, very rarely. It's, I mean, for one school to teach teachers from another school something is something that, some leaders try to do it, but it's difficult. So tell me a bit more about, what do you think we could be better at in the Nordic countries? Of course, Denmark is the place you've been most often, but also Sweden. I mean, in the Nordic countries, what can we learn from you?
Well, I think, again, if we take the big picture, any organization needs to be outward facing to be successful. So if you become inward looking, and we call it siloed, but if you become isolated as an organization, you tend to recycle the same ideas, you tend to fall into a pattern of practice that doesn't develop. And whether that's a business model or a medical model or an education model, it's the same everywhere. Even multinational companies at a huge scale will continue to look outwardly and collaborate over some things. Take the car industry. It's a perfect example of collaboration at an international level. We recognized in England that siloed effect on schools is a driver for a decline in educational standards. And it's particularly notable in what we call single academy trust. So it's where a school has stepped away from local authority governance or local authority accountability, but it isn't part of a group of other schools. They work on their own. So there's no external challenge and there's no external support other than through Ofsted. And we've seen educational standards drop in those examples. So they're really good case studies to look at. The teaching school model comes from hospitals, where really high quality hospitals become hospital schools, and they then can lead the training of medical professionals from other hospitals. And there's that kind of collaborative dynamic take place. And teaching schools are a similar model. So here, if you're an outstanding school, you can apply to become a teaching school, you get some additional government funding, and then you're responsible for teacher training, CPD, so the training of other educational professionals, and you're responsible for sort of subject-based expertise as well, and collaboration, so supporting around educational themes. So for me, it's the perfect example of schools taking leadership of their own kind of outcomes, but doing it in a way that they support the development of others in a collaborative model. It's changing in England. So in England, it's moving towards rather than individual schools applying. You now, or in the future, we'll be looking at big teaching school hubs that are working regionally, and they're kind of replacing a local authority model. But it's very much about developing leadership expertise, teaching expertise, and then developing those collaborative models around particular projects. And the time element is an interesting one. It's always the barrier in schools. Money can buy time to a certain extent. You can release teachers if there's some money to cover classes. And there is an economic model that sits behind this that allows teaching schools to generate some income, to release staff, to create that kind of collaborative model. So, you know, it depends which way you look at it, but I come from a perspective that collaboration is good. It's that social construction of knowledge. It's that ability to work together around particular themes. There is a view that competition drives up standards. I mean, that's what our government would say, that there needs to be competition in a free market economy to drive up standards. But I would argue that schools are not big enough organizations to be able to compete effectively. We need to be able to collaborate to improve. So in essence, that's what the teaching school model is. And there's collaboration beyond that as well. But it's, I'm an advocate for it, as you can probably hear.
Yeah, I can hear that. And in the Nordic countries, especially Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, we've been very obsessed about PISA, whereas Finland has been doing very well for the last 20 years. They've never been obsessed about PISA, which is very interesting. So they've never taken this this competitive way of doing it, whereas the three other countries, and Denmark, where I live, has taken this perspective about being competitors to each other and from school to school. So we could learn from your system. We could learn how to do more collaboration and how to do teaching schools, for example. Now, let's hear one more. If you were the Minister of Education in this country, or do you call it a minister or a secretary? What do you call it? Secretary? Minister?
Well, we have both. Yeah.
You have both. That's why I never understood.
Yeah. If I was the education minister, yeah.
One more thing you would do to improve the systems in the Nordic countries, especially Denmark, what would you do?
I think so. One of the fantastic things in education in England at the minute is an engagement with research and evidence. So we have seen, I think, is a golden era at the minute for educational professionals to be able to access high quality research and evidence to inform practice. And it's happening at different levels. So we have a new national professional governing body called the Chartered College of Teaching, which celebrates teachers and the teaching profession and provides really high quality resources behind that. And all of it is research based. We have an organization called the Education Endowment Foundation, which conducts large scale randomized controlled trials to work out what works and what doesn't work in education, and that's funded by the government. But I believe it's an independent charity, but it does a lot of work nationally. And then we have some of our traditional bodies, such as the National Foundation for Educational Research, the NFER, the British Educational Research Association, BERA. We've got universities involved with schools, and we have teacher-led research organizations like Research Ed, which is now international as well. So there's a lot going on here that I think, you could say it's all linked to performance, but for me, it's linked to professional inquiry, professional learning. One of the things that we know is that a professional is more likely to stay in role if they feel that they're invested in and they can continue to learn. And in fact, that's one of our five a day for well-being is continued learning. So we have a bit of a recruitment and retention crisis in this country, but we also know that if we can provide opportunities for professional learning, teachers are more likely to stay in the profession. And I'd love to see examples of that. It could already be taking place, I don't know, but I'd like to see more examples of that from the Nordic countries.
Yeah, sounds like a Very, very good idea. I think maybe Finland could say that they're doing that, but the other three countries are not doing it. The problem in our country and in Sweden and Norway, I would think, is that there's a lot of research and it does not meet the teachers. So some research would meet the teachers, but let alone the five big, the five big research areas that PISA covers, ICILS and ICCS and so forth. I mean, it's very often that the teachers do not know what this is about. So there is not this transition or this, I don't know what you call it, from the researchers to the teachers. How do you do that?
That's a really good question. And I think we could do another masterclass on this sometime, I think, and go into it in a bit more detail. It's also always been a challenge here that we have fantastic research, but it's not accessible to a busy teacher. So on the ground, one really good example is that where schools engage at a school level with research, so they might encourage their staff to do their own research projects or work together collaboratively around particular themes. And that's what I do a lot of, is supporting schools with that. That's one thing that you can do. We also ensure, so Education Endowment Foundation is a really good example of an organization that's presented research in a really easily readable, accessible way. So you can look at what has had the greatest impact on learning or the greatest financial investment in terms of an intervention or a strategy. And that's done online, and there's easy to use guidance reports and so on. So there's a growing recognition here from the people conducting the research that they need to provide research that's bite-sized and easily accessible. And time is always the barrier. One thing I would say on this, and this is, this would come out in more depth if we talked about it again, Casper, is the danger with this is that we become very formulaic with our teaching, and we forget what we were talking about earlier around the unmeasurable value of relationships, for example. So again, poor practice I see is where a school just adopts a strategy because the research says it's the latest great thing in teaching, and it doesn't consider the context or the community within which that's being delivered in a school. And that takes a real skill. So I try and encourage professionals to critically engage with research, so to see where the opportunities are, but also understand where the limitations are, and use your kind of, I call it craft knowledge, your experience of your community and your school and your kids, to understand what we need to be looking at. And that's a whole new kind of level of thinking, really. But yeah, I honestly, you've done a TEDx talk, you're a TED talker. It's that kind of, and even this kind of masterclass, it's the kind of way of making expertise accessible to people that are really, really busy. Yeah.
Exactly, because there's always this time factor. I mean, any accessibility is fine, but if if you feel you don't have the time, then when will you use it? Let's just one of the few last things I'd like to talk about is the thing about research, because I was just talking to Jeppe Bundsgaard, which is a Danish researcher, and he was actually behind PISA Danish and also ICILS, which is his baby, and which is about literacy, IT, information technology literacy. And it's really interesting how they test, because you can always, do the classic tests and say, I can prove my method is better than yours. But I think what's new in PISA and in ICILS about IT competences is that they test in different ways. So they do problem solving. For example, they say you have to program this drone, and here's the drone. How will you make the drone fly another way? And then they have to solve the problem in real life, not just, write down what you want to do. No, they have to solve the real problem. And this is also what they're doing more and more in PISA, as far as I have understood. Because I think it can be dangerous, as you say, to say, okay, we can prove that this works. For example, during the lockdown, there's been a lot of outdoors teaching. When the kids came back, it's been outdoors. I mean, they spent half of the day outdoors. And I know it's a good idea, but I have difficulties in proving it. So you can say, oh, they have to go indoors because then they can do this and that. They can Danish, they can do English, and they can do maths. And it's difficult to prove that it works to go outdoors. And that's the problem I have, and that a lot of teachers have, with saying that things are research-based. And also there's been, the PISA has been used since 2001 to say to Danish teachers in schools that they're not doing well enough, especially Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish schools, whereas it's the opposite in Finland. But now we're doing very well in this country, and everybody's happy, and nobody knows. So basically, how well do you think it works to get research out to the teachers in England? Because that's what, yeah, in England.
Well, I think, I mean, you touched on a couple of things there. One of the things that we know is that schools are really complex environments to research, really, really difficult places to research. So, and research can take different approaches to measure performance. Again, from a school perspective, one of the things that I think that we've struggled with in England is that we've done a lot of evaluation. We've done a lot of weighing how much, rather than working out how something works. And I think that that's where research can now begin to play a part, is unpicking how things work. And there are different ways. So some researchers would do that from a laboratory basis. So they'll test one thing in a lab and then try and upscale and test it in a school. You could take a kind of medical approach like randomized controlled trials, where you research at scale and try and work out what works, a bit like you do with medicines and placebos. As you said, you know, you can get research to tell you all kinds of things. It's about how you then engage with that and use that to inform your practice, and that is a real skill. You know, is that's an art in itself. If I believe that we as a species are inquisitive by nature. You could say that teenagers lose that inquisitiveness at some stage of their lives, but it's always there, hidden away. You know, we want to continue to work things out and problem solve. That's what a lot of us do with our professional lives as well. And I think giving professionals the opportunity to be inquisitive, and understand how they can research their own practice and reflect on their own practice is a really, really powerful model for professional development, or I call it professional learning. You know, that to me is the golden thread in terms of professional development. And those schools that have a cultural approach to do that, you know, that's the norm, that they encourage their staff to be inquisitive and learning, tend to do really, really well. Often when I work with teachers, they're not used to working in that way, and they struggle and they lack confidence. You know, that they worry that they can't do the reading and do the thinking. But as they develop their confidence and their skills, you can see professionals really get to that point where they're very accurate, reflecting on their own practice, and they're open-minded to different ways of working, informed by what they read. And, you know, trying to deliver that through, whether it's a podcast or a short webinar, or through a professional journal, whatever it may be. They're all different ways that you can encourage people to engage. Twitter here in England is a massive thing for teachers. And we have an app that some academics have created called Teacher Tap, which is Teacher TAPP. And it's a weekly kind of audit of professional questions that goes out to teachers at 3 o'clock every afternoon, or once a week, with a report the following week of the findings from the week before. So again, it's little things like that, using technology to make things accessible for teachers.
I can just say you're far ahead of us on that level, and it sounds really, really interesting. And of course, if you want to, as a teacher, reflect on your own practice, you can use the Nordic teaching model. But let's leave that for now. Jim, last question. If, like you have, you would, people who are watching would think, oh, maybe I should do a school visit in Denmark, Sweden, Norway, or so forth. Denmark, and they could call us. So why should they do that? Why should they go to Denmark?
Well, I've been to Denmark and Sweden, and both countries I've been with teachers. Okay, both have been hugely formative for my own professional learning, my own professional development. We came out and visited Denmark with school leaders and teachers last autumn, and through a structured visit where we had opportunities for teachers to reflect on what they were seeing and then conduct school visits, meet school leaders and look at the children, I think probably would have had more impact on professional learning than anything else that those teachers did during that academic year. I think we've got huge opportunities to both consider different ways of working, but also sometimes to reaffirm what our own practice is all about. It's an opportunity to take some perspective on what we do, to step away and look at our own practice. And right now, and this is a really important thing, I think, we touched on it several times in this discussion, but your holistic approach to education, your broad curriculum, your inherent focus on well-being, I think are really strong messages that we can continue to learn from and reinforce our own practice in England. A huge opportunity, I think, for professional learning through an international visit, without a doubt. And it's not very expensive if one day we're allowed to leave our island and come and visit you again.
I really hope you are. Thanks a lot, Jim Rogers. I'm sorry about the noise. If somebody heard that, that's my poor black Labrador. It's 25 degrees in Denmark, and she was drinking water. She's called Bentley. Unfortunately, I do not have the car Bentley, but I do have a dog called Bentley. So I hope it did not make too much noise. Jim, thank you very much for inviting people to Denmark. Thank you very much. Giving them a reason to come here when the borders open. I can say right now, the borders to Germany and Norway and Iceland are open. We can't go anywhere else, but hopefully we can before very long. Jim Rogers, thank you very much. If you want to listen, if one wanted to listen to your podcast, Jim, what should they do? Because they're brilliant.
Or I'd need to find the web address. We'll provide some notes, I would imagine, with this webinar, and I'll give you a link to the podcasts. Some of them are available through my website, www.jimrogerstraining, which is ROGERS training. My one with you is on there. I'm very proud of it. I'm really enjoying the podcast because it's an opportunity for me to speak with some really, really good, interesting, informative people. So if you can listen, that'd be great. And just to say a massive thank you, Casper, for inviting me along to this today. I've been really looking forward to it. It's been very enjoyable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. I will stop the recording now and invite all the viewers to see the next, which will be with, who knows? For now, I don't know. We'll find out.